On this edition of The Fifth Estate.
Why would you have tried to do a vaccine partnership with a country that is holding two of our citizens hostage?
The story of the Prime Minister's plan to produce a domestic COVID vaccine, made in Canada, but with help from a vaccine company in China and the Chinese military.
I don't think we should be collaborating with any entity that is affiliated with China's military. I think that is a clear and serious threat to our national security.
And I think that'll go down in history as an absolutely incomprehensible and frankly deadly decision.
We're rolling the cameras here. Have you got your cameras going? Now, the interview Canada's COVID vaccine partner doesn't want Canadians to see. Was that not exactly the wrong environment in which to go into a collaboration with a Chinese company? Hello, I'm Bob McKeown. Welcome to a new season of The Fifth Estate. It was intended to be the principal pandemic protection for Canadians, a domestic COVID-19 vaccine made right here at home. Yet for all the millions spent and the promises made, to date, not a single dose of that COVID-19 domestic vaccine has been given to Canadians. So, how and why could that happen?
Bonjour tout le monde. I want to begin by recognizing that a lot of people have now been stuck at home for a week or more because of COVID-19. If that's starting to take a toll, it's understandable.
Less than 2 weeks after the pandemic was officially declared, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau unveils his strategy to defeat the coronavirus, a made-in-Canada COVID-19 vaccine.
Today, I can announce that we're providing $192 million to directly support vaccine development and production in Canada. We're investing in a long-term solution to COVID-19 right here at home.
Very early on, we wanted to make sure that there was a domestic supply.
According to Dr. Scott Halprin of Dalhousie University, one of Canada's top vaccine researchers, the first challenge was to identify an effective vaccine, then a way to get it.
At the beginning, we didn't know how the vaccines, how many of the vaccines would be successful, where they would be manufactured, whether the borders would be open or not.
It's called America First.
What they did know is that vaccine security was important to Canada, because south of the border was an American president threatening to hoard everything COVID-related.
We need the masks. We don't want other people getting it.
So Canada would have to develop the right COVID-19 vaccine, then build a manufacturing facility to produce it.
Once there are promising options, Canada needs the capacity to mass produce treatments as quickly as possible.
Vaccinologist Scott Halprin said, given Canada's level of preparedness, or lack of it, vaccine mass production was far more easily said than done.
Not prepared at all. Canada was prepared for a flu pandemic, which was predicted to be the most likely pandemic that we would see. But those facilities are not adaptable to be able to change over to make an mRNA vaccine or to make a vectored viral vaccine. That was one of the initial priorities as soon as the pandemic was declared, but you can't make those manufacturing facilities overnight.
But the Prime Minister was insistent Canada would be getting into the COVID-19 vaccine business.
That's why we're investing in the National Research Council of Canada's facility in Montreal to prepare for the rollout.
The National Research Council, the NRC, is the federal government's research hub in Montreal and an obvious location to be ramped up to mass produce COVID vaccine.
We need all hands on deck.
And the NRC already had its eyes on a promising candidate, a vaccine being developed at lightning speed, though not in Canada, in China. The vaccine was developed along with the Beijing Institute of Biotechnology, in fact, an arm of China's military. Chinese soldiers were the first to be given the vaccine on a limited basis. by mid-March, soon after the pandemic was declared, formal human trials started in China.
The results of that first study were exciting enough to make me feel very optimistic at that time.
Louis Barreto has been a leading biomedical researcher in Canada for decades. While working at a Toronto lab, he first met the people who today are top executives of a major Chinese vaccine company called CanSino Biologics. Barreto is now their scientific advisor.
This was a group of young scientists who were my colleagues at Connaught Laboratories and Sanofi Pasteur for many years, with whom I have developed many vaccines currently used in Canada. The injectable polio, which is a hallmark of this country with a lot of history, as you know, that every child in this country and millions of children around the world get because of innovation from Canada. So these are a group of people with whom I worked on many vaccines.
Well, vaccines save lives, right? This is something, everybody deserve a better life, and you produce something that help people.
Dr. Xu Fengyu, seen in this corporate video, was one of Barreto's Toronto colleagues. He co-founded CanSino more than a decade ago, and he's now CEO. We spoke to Dr. Yu from CanSino's offices in China.
Every country needs vaccines, same as in Canada. I think the government do whatever they can do to find the vaccines that could be, available for them. This is their job. I think they take the responsibility.
Dr. Yu gave us a wide-ranging interview. But as soon as it was over, we were told that CanSino had seized the footage, taken it from our crew in China. It was released 10 days later. But then we learned that CanSino had erased half the interview, including references to the Chinese military. We're rolling the cameras here. Have you got your cameras going? But fortunately, our cameras in Toronto recorded the entire interview. Dr. Yu's answers not only captured on his microphone, but on mine too. We've added subtitles to the audio that CanSino apparently didn't want you to hear. The Beijing Institute of Biotechnology is effectively the scientific research arm of the People's Liberation Army, of the Chinese military. How does that enter into this equation?
Well, I see them as a collaborator. It's just a research institute, right?
The key to the Canada-CanSino deal was that the National Research Council had licensed what's called the NRC cell line to CanSino, Canadian medical technology that's a building block for vaccines. CanSino has been using it for years. Add it all up, and Dr. Barreto, who also formerly worked for the NRC, saw a COVID vaccine opportunity for Canada.
You had the scientists who had roots here, you had the cell lines here, you had the experience there. Let's bring it to Canada. That is what the intention was, and produce it in Canada and for Canadians first.
Scott Halpern says he too believed it was the right decision for Canada, because CanSino was then near the lead in the worldwide race for a COVID vaccine.
And I think they were one day later than Moderna or Pfizer, who was the first. So they were almost at the same time as the first vaccines off the mark doing phase 1 studies.
Dr. Halpern's Center for Vaccinology at the IWK Hospital in Halifax conducts human trials for vaccines around the world. The NRC and CanSino asked him to oversee the trials for their COVID-19 vaccine.
Would we be willing to do the early phase studies? And since that was our role, and our focus was to do studies of vaccines that would be available to Canada, that was the first group that we had talked to.
About 6 weeks after Justin Trudeau first mentioned a domestic Canadian COVID vaccine, the NRC signed a contract with CanSino to produce one. Much is redacted, but what isn't reveals that the agreement was to fast-track the availability of a COVID-19 vaccine in Canada for emergency pandemic use. And then there's this, acknowledgement that CanSino had been fully authorized by the Beijing Institute of Biotechnology. In other words, they were in business with the scientific research arm of the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army.
It was not the fact that it was made in Canada that was important alone. It is the fruits of innovation that had an aspect of it, very strong aspect of it, in Canada, with the clinical trial infrastructure that is excellent in Canada. We all should be extremely proud of that.
Early in May 2020, the federal government approved CanSino's vaccine for human trials in Canada. The Prime Minister announced it in his COVID brief to the country.
I want to start with some news on the medical front. Health Canada has now approved the first Canadian clinical trials for a potential COVID-19 vaccine at the Canadian Centre for Vaccinology at Dalhousie University. The National Research Council of Canada will be working with the manufacturers so that if these vaccine trials are successful, we can produce and distribute it here at home.
But curiously, Justin Trudeau didn't identify CanSino by name as the company in China that was Canada's COVID vaccine partner. He also didn't tell Canadians that CanSino's partner in the project, and therefore Canada's too, was the Chinese military. After the break, what were the warnings from Canadian intelligence and China analysts? And were they ignored?
China didn't uphold its end of the bargain. It took the patent, used the patent, and then denied the export of vaccines to this country. So yes, CSIS advice was not only timely, but unheeded.
The Prime Minister insists politics played no role in the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, but it's certain to be political now.
It was 15 months before the world would be locked down by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the arrest of a high-profile Chinese tech executive on criminal charges in the U.S. would turn up the heat on long-simmering tensions between Canada and China.
Some of you are here probably just to see what a spy looks like. And as you can see, I look nothing like Daniel Craig.
Just days after Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou's arrest, the director of CSIS, Canada's intelligence agency, delivered a most unusual public warning about state-sponsored espionage aimed at Canada.
What I consider to be the greatest threat to our prosperity and national interest, namely foreign interference and espionage.
David Vigneault did not use the name China. He didn't have to.
I'm talking about areas such as AI, quantum computing, 5G, biopharma, clean tech. In other words, the foundations of Canada's future economic growth.
Things have changed with China.
Conservative MP and then Foreign Affairs critic Michael Chong.
The detention of the two Michaels. He enumerated these 5 areas where foreign actors were threatening our national security and intellectual property. Clearly, that speech was a reference to China without explicitly naming it.
And not long after the Huawei executive's arrest in Vancouver, authorities in China seized 2 Canadians, former diplomat Michael Kovrig and consultant Michael Spavor. The threat to Canada was never more clear.
I was in Shanghai when the Michaels were taken. I was floored.
Margaret McQuaig-Johnston spent her career with the federal government, promoting science and technology partnerships between Canada and China. She now researches Canada-China relations at the University of Ottawa.
We've thought of China as an open collaborator, but since the kidnapping of the Michaels, we've seen that China has a malign intent towards us.
Privately, McQuaig-Johnston was warning federal officials about the pitfalls of doing business with China. Canadian companies forced to give up their controlling interest in Chinese ventures and their own intellectual property.
And I started finding it was 90-10 or 80-20 or 70-30 in favor of the Chinese partner when it was 100% the Canadian technology that was being made. And you had to make it in China for the Chinese market. And so some of them just abandoned the whole joint venture and sold their IP or gave their IP to their Chinese partner, who then becomes their competitor. I'm thinking to myself, this is not a friendly country to do something like this to us on such a consistent basis.
And by July 2019, Canadian intelligence was no longer satisfied to watch and warn about perceived threats.
She and the team at the National Microbiology Lab have been praised for developing an Ebola vaccine. But just over a week ago, Chu, her husband, and her students from China were evicted from Canada's only Level 4 lab, their security access revoked.
We had the two government scientists in the Winnipeg lab that had been escorted out by the RCMP a year earlier. So it was clear by May of 2020 that China was not a reliable partner.
And the month before Canada's vaccine deal with CanSino, there was this. A brief from CSIS to the Canadian biopharma industry, warning of pandemic-related espionage, this time specifically naming China. The threat is no longer hypothetical. Canadian biopharma and health organizations have been targeted. It is no secret that we are most concerned about the actions of countries like China and Russia.
I've, over the years, had different contacts with CSIS who come to sort of just let me know if there are any concerns, what the concerns are, things to be aware of, computer security, all those sorts of issues. So I was certainly aware of those issues.
But Dr. Scott Halpern says he had no such problems in his relationship with CanSino.
In the case of my interaction with CanSino, the collaboration is in the other direction. So if there were to be any concern, it would be from China being concerned that we had access, we had data of theirs as opposed to the other direction.
The question is, given all of the red flags and warnings in the years and months leading up to the pandemic, how could the Trudeau government gamble its crucial domestic vaccine supply on a deal with a company based in China?
I was incredulous that the government had chosen to partner not only with CanSino, but with China after all the things that had happened in the previous 2 years.
Why would you have tried to do a vaccine partnership with a country that is holding two of our citizens hostage?
The CanSino partnership is a long-established partnership between Chinese researchers and Canadians that indeed resulted a few years ago in tremendous success in developing methods to counter Ebola. This was a well-established partnership well before COVID-19 that has been effective in the past.
As you'll see, it is hard to square the Prime Minister's reference to tremendous success with what actually happened. Consider this. In 2014, the year the Ebola pandemic hit West Africa, CanSino had already paid to license the NRC cell line. Researchers with the Chinese military wanted it for an Ebola vaccine. But the partnership with Canada was about to hit a rough patch.
Canada's foreign minister is in Beijing trying to smooth the way for the Prime Minister's next visit, just when Canada is accusing China of spying.
That same year, the Harper government publicly blamed Chinese agents for hacking into the National Research Council's computer system.
Canada's National Research Council said it was hacked by Chinese cyber spies.
The hack reportedly shut down NRC computers for a year and inflicted hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. Nevertheless, the NRC's relationship with China somehow survived. CanSino's Ebola vaccine would be tested on Africans, but to date it has been approved for use in just a single country, China, largely for Chinese soldiers going to Africa. So evaluate the tremendous successes, as Mr. Trudeau put it, of the Ebola vaccine. What was that tremendous success?
We have demonstrated the vaccine works, And that has been evaluated also by our Canadian scientists as well. So I think that is successful.
So it's been approved in one country and used by that country for its soldiers being deployed to Africa.
Not just soldiers, the medical professionals and the people going there for other purposes.
I don't think we should be collaborating with any entity that is affiliated with the People's Liberation Army, that is affiliated with China's military. I think that is a clear and serious threat to our national security and to our intellectual property regime.
So in the early grip of the pandemic, Canada's Prime Minister and his government would overlook a lot. The long arm of China's military, warnings from the Canadian intelligence community, and growing tensions with the world's rising superpower, all to place a bet on CanSino to protect Canadians with a made-in-Canada COVID-19 vaccine. When we return, what happened to the vaccine?
Then we knew it wasn't just the right paperwork and bureaucracy, it was just not coming to Canada. And at that point we just said, this is not happening.
We're doing CPR right now. I need the crash cart of meds to come in the room.
May 2020, the third long month of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the Prime Minister had something momentous to tell Canadians. The first much-anticipated made-in-Canada COVID vaccine was about to start clinical trials.
Research and development take time and must be done right, but this is encouraging news.
The CanSino vaccine was in a climate-controlled facility at Beijing Airport. All that remained was to load it onto a flight to Toronto. But that would never happen. Dr. Louis Barreto had brokered the Canadian deal with CanSino. He insists it wasn't the company's fault that the vaccine shipment didn't leave China.
As far as CanSino is concerned, the vaccine was sent out. There were customs clearance issues that arose.
An internal government memo a few days later indicates the Canadian embassy in Beijing was on the case. CanSino vaccines are still with customs in China. Embassy has a meeting tomorrow. Assuming they get through customs tomorrow, they can be put on a flight on the 27th. But May 27th came and went. In Canada, still no COVID vaccine.
It was kept in appropriate refrigerated conditions, and it got taken back by CanSino. While negotiations went at the highest level to try and see if that could be sorted out.
At the IWK Health Centre in Halifax, the researcher chosen to oversee CanSino's Canadian trials, Dr. Scott Halpern, could only watch and wait.
We already had everything ready to start the study the minute that the vaccine arrived in Canada. We actually had the point where we were already recruiting people to be ready to be available to be enrolled in that clinical trial.
But at the same time, the possible deportation of the Chinese tech executive to face fraud charges in the U.S. was headline news in Canada.
Meng's been in detention at home for 18 months, her movements limited.
Dr. Halpern couldn't help but wonder if the homegrown COVID-19 vaccine had somehow become entangled in the high-stakes standoff between Canada and China.
Things had just sort of heated up at that point, and that's why our first suspicion was that this was all being rolled into that.
Prior to May, a small amount of the CanSino vaccine had been exported from China to the University of Saskatchewan's Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization for animal trials. That also required doses of the vaccine to be sent from China.
That's right.
And they arrived without customs problems?
They did. Yeah, it was zero problems.
So what was the difference between the vaccines for the animal trials and the human trials?
I do not know. I do not. That's what boggles my mind as well. There was customs clearance issues for the human trials.
So when they say the custom is stopping the vaccines, of course this is not the case.
At McGill University, Ben Feng is an artificial intelligence and security researcher. From Canada, he's also an outspoken critic of China's human rights record. Can you go home to Hong Kong?
My family would not allow me to do that. It would be a bit risky.
They would be afraid of what?
They would be afraid of they will put me in jail.
And Ben Feng warns that the greatest risks are when the partner in a joint venture has links to the Chinese military, as CanSino has with the People's Liberation Army.
If that university or if that company has a strong association with the army in China, it is very likely that the technology will eventually be transferred to the army in China. So that's the issues.
Meng Wanzhou smiled politely as she walked into court this morning.
Just weeks after Meng Wanzhou lost her appeal to the BC Supreme Court, Chinese authorities charged the two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, with espionage.
So we will continue to ask the Chinese and put pressure on the Chinese government to cease the arbitrary detention of these two Canadian citizens who are being held for no other reason than they are, the Chinese government is disappointed with the independent proceedings of the Canadian judiciary.
But the Chinese Foreign Ministry insisted there was no connection between the Meng case and the Michaels, and told the Prime Minister to stop making irresponsible remarks. And as political tensions between the two countries mounted, only one COVID-19 vaccine had yet been approved for clinical trials in Canada: the CanSino vaccine, still being held in China. When Dr. Scott Halpern learned CanSino had successfully shipped its COVID vaccine to Russia and Pakistan, he says he knew the writing was on the wall for Canada.
When we found that the CanSino was able to, allowed by the Chinese government, to ship vaccine, but still were having problems with shipping to Canada, then we knew it wasn't just the right paperwork and bureaucracy, it was just not coming to Canada. And at that point we just said, this is not happening.
So the saga of Canada's domestic COVID-19 vaccine effectively ended before it began.
When these collaborations started on vaccines, there was no thought in anyone's mind that that kind of research and that kind of product could be turned against us. And I'm sure the senior officials in China and party leaders were thrilled that they had yet another way that they could punish us, in addition to kidnapping two of our citizens.
Dr. Shufeng Yu is a McGill PhD grad, Canadian citizen, and co-founder and CEO of CanSino. He denies knowing why the COVID-19 vaccine was held back from Canada. This is part of our interview with him that CanSino tried to censor. We've subtitled it for clarity.
So you don't believe there was any political interference, that this had nothing to do with the arrest of the Huawei executive or the two Michaels?
Sorry to say this. I don't work for the government either side. I really have no clue what's going on behind the doors of the country.
Dr. Yu says what happened is that after the delay in delivering the vaccine, CanSino decided not to send it to Canada after all, because COVID cases here were declining, and they feared there might not be enough subjects to do comprehensive human testing.
The case went down at the time when I actually went back in September, August. I see there was a few, less than 100 cases a day. I thought we made the right decision, because at that time we were already starting in Palestine, in Russia, and Mexico, and Chile.
Whatever the reason the deal for Canada's first domestic COVID vaccine fell through, the government evidently was in no hurry to tell Canadians about it.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone.
When the collapse of the agreement did finally publicly leak, the Prime Minister visited the National Research Council in Montreal, though not to discuss CanSino.
Today, I can announce that the Government of Canada has signed 2 new agreements with Novavax and Johnson & Johnson to reserve millions of doses of the vaccines they're developing. On a donc investi.
That news might have been good, but it was also premature. Under pressure to be transparent, the government released copies of those foreign vaccine contracts. The agreement for the J&J vaccine was actually signed not as the Prime Minister announced in August 2020, but months later, in November. And that Novavax contract wasn't signed until January 2021. We asked the Prime Minister's office to explain the discrepancies in those dates, but they didn't give us an answer.
La COVID-19.
Even more questionable was what the Prime Minister and his Innovation Minister announced about ramping up the NRC's capacity for vaccine production.
The NRC facility here at Royal Mount is now on track to produce 250,000 vaccine doses per month starting this fall.
But remember, when they said that, they already knew the CanSino deal was dead, meaning they no longer had a partner with whom to produce all of that vaccine. But still, the government kept making promises.
You build the cells, and then you have to sort of replicate them.
Trudeau even took the media on a tour of the NRC lab, where his pledge of domestic vaccine security supposedly was about to come true. MP and NDP health critic Don Davies.
One would hope that when the Prime Minister speaks, he knows what he's talking about and it's accurate. So he either was mistaken or he was misleading. And I think it's incumbent on him to explain which of those it is. What we do know is that we didn't produce 250,000 doses in Canada in November in Montreal.
And misleading or not, the news kept coming.
I can also announce that we're investing over $126 million to expand the biomanufacturing facility right here at the National Research Council, Royal Mount. This funding will increase this facility's ability to manufacture vaccines and will strengthen the NRC's partnerships with vaccine developers. We expect the facility to be up and running by mid-2021.
So the NRC was said to be on track to produce 250,000 domestic vaccine doses a month by the fall of 2020, and up to 2 million doses a month by the fall of 2021. But just 3 months later, Justin Trudeau's message would change.
One of the things to remember is Canada no longer has any domestic production capacity for vaccines. We used to have it decades ago, but we no longer have it.
How is it the Prime Minister could stand up in August and say we're going to be producing vaccines and 90 days later say we don't even have the ability to do so? And he's never come clean on how that could be. I personally think that it's linked to CanSino. He bet Canada's domestic vaccine production capacity on CanSino in Montreal. When that fell apart, we were left in the lurch. And to this day, Canadians won't see a domestic vaccine produced in Canada until 2022 at the earliest.
As much as the federal government wanted to forget CanSino and focus on their new foreign vaccine purchases, questions about the ill-fated deal with China were just beginning. That after the break.
There were circumstances there that were dangerous to take a gamble on.
What is the danger, first of all? I'm Canadian. You say I'm dangerous?
At its headquarters in Tianjin, China, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a boon for CanSino Biologics. On worldwide sales of its single-shot COVID-19 vaccine, the one that never got to Canada, this year the company has reported its first profits ever. Forbes magazine has valued 4 of CanSino's executives as billionaires, including Dr. Shofeng Yu, seen here on corporate video. Remember, it was CanSino which had the video from our interview in China seized, then erased. But we had our own camera in Canada. What follows, presumably, is what CanSino doesn't want Canadians to see.
Do you believe that was a deal fatally flawed? That there were circumstances there that were dangerous to take a gamble on?
What is the danger, first of all? I'm Canadian. You say I'm dangerous? Why?
No, I'm saying that the relationship between CanSino and the People's Liberation Army or the Communist Party of China, under these circumstances, meant that it was less predictable that you could bring this vaccine to market in Canada. And in fact, to this day, not a single dose of a domestic vaccine has been produced in Canada. CanSino's or anybody else's?
Unfortunately, I don't know what happens this day, but don't blame a Canadian work on the COVID-19 vaccine, which I cannot bring back to Canada, I'm afraid, or vendors.
While it appears the Chinese government played hardball vaccine diplomacy with Canada, to this day, Canadian scientists are still helping to develop the CanSino vaccine. The results of trials from several countries are flown to Canada and evaluated here at the Nexcellis lab in Laval, Quebec.
Nexcellis is a company that does assays, laboratory assays, and takes the blood is sent to them, and then they test for antibodies, they test for the T-cell responses and cellular immunity.
And in Halifax, Dr. Scott Halprin continues to be lead global investigator for the CanSino vaccine.
And that vaccine will likely never come to Canada at this stage. It's going to be used around the world in other places, but not in Canada. It doesn't really have a future in Canada at this stage.
But the vaccine does have a future elsewhere. It's been approved in Mexico, in Pakistan, Hungary, and Chile, among other countries.
I look at this as part of Canada's contribution to the global battle against COVID-19 is that we're collaborating with a country that's supplying vaccine to other places, including emerging nations.
We went to Russia and Brazil and Saudi Arabia. So China was using this vaccine where we provided the cell line for the whole vaccine to kiss up to their autocratic neighbors.
Former government official Margaret McQuaig Johnston, who spent her career building science and tech partnerships with China, sees the failed CanSino deal in more stark terms.
You would think that vaccines are perfectly innocent science. Certainly the National Research Council would have seen, and I would have seen, the collaboration with CanSino as beneficial to both parties, because you have smart scientists from both countries looking at the challenges and trying to solve them. But in our case, CanSino's vaccine was weaponized by the Chinese authorities.
I hope that whatever you were going to do today, you do in any case. We would not want to be interrupting one vaccine getting to any person in the world.
This past June, Prime Minister Trudeau toured the Pfizer vaccine plant in Belgium to thank the company and the Belgian Prime Minister for their pandemic support.
I will say that Pfizer has been just so solid as a partner.
Even if the Prime Minister hasn't disclosed how much Canada is paying for each Pfizer dose, you can understand his gratitude. So far, the company has provided 2/3 of Canada's COVID vaccine supply. Because for all of Justin Trudeau's early talk about securing a made-in-Canada vaccine, that still hasn't happened. And at what cost?
When the CanSino deal blew up and fell apart, we missed the opportunity to have partnered with these other companies. And, I don't think you're going to see domestic production of vaccines in Canada till 2022, when we could have been producing probably in late 2020. So that's 18 months, maybe 2 years, that we could have been producing vaccines in this country. And when you're in a global pandemic that is deadly, that costs lives.
And consider this. After the CanSino deal fell apart, and before foreign vaccines started to arrive, Canada signed an agreement with the World Health Organization's Global Vaccine Program. aimed at helping poorer nations to get vaccines during the pandemic. Canada obtained nearly 1 million COVID doses from that program, vaccine primarily intended for countries which dramatically trail Canadian vaccination rates.
They say you shouldn't waste a good crisis. If there's some very important lessons to be learned from COVID, and I think that's got to be one of the most fundamental, is we need to never allow Canada to be in the position again where we are unable to produce vaccines and essential medicines in this country.
Domestic vaccine production in Canada has certainly been delayed. This past summer, the National Research Council held a media conference at its new $126 million manufacturing plant in Montreal. Remember, the Prime Minister had said that by now it would be producing up to 2 million vaccine doses a month. But the headline here was that they just finished construction. The government now says the NRC facility won't produce those 2 million monthly doses until 2022. And the NRC's main partner here, Novavax, is still awaiting Health Canada's approval for its COVID vaccine.
The big news is that now we're going to have this facility, which is owned by Canadians, which will be able to partner. Our partner now is Novavax, but we can be partnering with others.
For months, we have attempted to ask the Prime Minister, his cabinet ministers, and the NRC about Canada's first COVID vaccine partner, CanSino. All declined to speak on camera. The National Research Council did send a written statement saying that they worked with CanSino, but not the Chinese military, and that they consulted Canada's lead security agencies about the COVID vaccine deal. And another postscript. Late in September, Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou reached an agreement with U.S. prosecutors and was allowed to go home to China. And after 1,020 days in Chinese prisons, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor returned home to Canada. Like the CanSino vaccine that never arrived, their detention was seen as punishment for Canada from China. The two episodes now seemingly linked forever. It was distinguished Canadian researcher Louis Barreto who helped facilitate the ill-fated COVID collaboration with China. Dr. Barreto still believes that whatever went right or wrong with this one, the search for new vaccines should always be seen as science, never as something political.
Good science is a great opportunity to build bridges with whoever it is, with your enemies, with your partners, wherever, all over. These things are overcome with good science, good partnerships, in my opinion. And I'm hoping that one day we'll be doing this again, at least at the scientific level. The rest is beyond my objective in life.
If you have a story you think needs to be told, send us your tips at fifthtips@cbc.ca. And for a more confidential way to contact us, visit our website at cbc.ca/fifth and click on Secure Drop.